Hello, good day, everyone. My name is Neil Roberts, and I teach Africana Studies, Political Theory, and the Philosophy of Religion here at Williams College. And in addition to chairing the Africana Studies Department, I have the pleasure of directing our college's W. Ford Schuman 50 program in Democratic Studies, which is one of the primary sponsors for today's event. And so I would like to be able to kind of thank my colleagues in the Schuman program, particularly Carrie Green, Veronica Bosley, and Carrie Pierce, and also thank Paula Consolini and the Center for Learning in Action, our other co-sponsor, for making this event possible. In terms of our upcoming programming, for those who are tuning in now, hopefully you can also join us as well. Next week, Tuesday, March 16th, we will be hosting an event entitled On Cast, a virtual conversation with Isabel Wilkerson about her recent prize-winning book. And Wilkerson will be in conversation with one of our graduates, Hari Ramesh, class of 2011, who is currently a lecturer in social studies at Harvard University. And so we welcome you then and also to other future programming. In 1990, the philosopher and feminist political theorist Iris Marion Young published a very important book entitled Justice and the Politics of Difference. And if you have not read this book, I really encourage you to do so. But in 1990, why am I opening with this? Our guest today does not open with this, but I'm going to open with this. I say that because 100 years ago, this year, 2021, 100 years would be the birthday of the late Harvard philosopher John Rawls. And this is also the 50th anniversary of Rawls's important work, A Theory of Justice, that has been a book that has been adopted not merely in philosophy and political science, but in various kind of humanities, social sciences, the physical and natural sciences, and continues to be a subject of debate. But I focus with Young because in 1990, Young went through the series of literatures on the question of justice, including the work of John Rawls, and posed what seemed to be a very simple proposition that fundamentally transformed the ways that many of us study justice and analyze it, which is, Young argued, if we want to understand what justice means, we need to start with its opposite, in her view, injustice. Right? If we actually understand injustice and actually give definitions, or what Young famously called the 5 faces of oppression, to talk about different pillars of what constitute injustice, then that could arguably be the basis to come up with not only a theory of justice, but how can we have a more well-ordered kind of and just society. I open because of that, because the discussion today by our featured speaker, Mistrust, arguably, I would suggest, is attempting to do a similar feat for a different concept that has application in everyday life. By thinking about mistrust, what do we mean by mistrust? Then perhaps that might be a way for us to then understand not only how there might be faith or the loss of faith in institutions, but then to think about what would it mean to have a society that forges trust, and what can we even make when mistrust exists, right? Perhaps mistrust itself can be an organizing force. I may have this wrong, but I at least wanted to
you're doing great.
Pose that as well. So who is this kind of featured speaker, speak on mistrust, why losing faith in institutions provides the tools to transform them. From the Tea Party to Occupy Wall Street, and from cryptocurrency advocates to the Me Too movement, Americans and citizens of democracies worldwide are losing confidence in what we once called the system. This loss of faith has spread beyond government to infect a broad swath of institutions, for instance, corporations, digital platforms, the press, none of which seem capable of holding us together. The dominant theme of contemporary civic life is mistrust in institutions. That is big business, government, the press, the healthcare system, for instance. How should we encourage participation in public life when neither elections nor protests feel like paths to change? Drawing on work by political scientists, legal theorists, and activists in the streets, our guest Ethan Zuckerman offers a lens for understanding civic engagement that focuses on efficacy, that is, the power of seeing the change you make in the world. Ethan Zuckerman, Williams class of 1993, and also notably a 2014 College Bicentennial Medalist, is founder of the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and is also an associate professor of public policy, information, and communication. From 2011 to 2020, he led the Center for Civic Media at the MIT Media Lab, and he is co-founder with Rebecca McKinnon of the international blogging community Global Voices. And so today I'm going to briefly kind of mute myself and turn off my camera. But for approximately, I believe, between 30 and 40 minutes, we'll have, or 30 minutes, probably closer to 30, a formal talk. And then we really want to be able to open it up to your questions to have at least as much equal time for questions. So whichever device you're using, a computer, your phone, or however you're connecting, there is a Q&A feature near the bottom of the screen. So if you can pose any questions that you have, we'll be able to pose those to our guests to answer and really commune together. So join me in welcoming Ethan Zuckerman. Thank you, Ethan. I'm really looking forward to the talk and conversation.
Neil, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you all. First of all, let me just say, you don't really have to worry about people asking questions. I've taken a look at the participants, and they include a lot of old friends who I know are opinionated people and like asking questions. So I feel optimistic that we'll have a robust discussion coming out of this. I am terribly sorry that we can't have this meeting in person. It's always nice when coming back to one's alma mater to be physically there. I believe this event was originally planned to be held at Woodhouse. For some reason, they decided that wasn't a very good idea. But it's a lovely time to be talking about this question of mistrust in institutions at a moment where America's just really gone through an incredible spell of doubt and mistrust in institutions of all sorts, both around the COVID pandemic, but of course around the events of January 6th. We've just been through this quite astonishing period of what people are now in retrospect starting to call the big lie, where we've had a moment where the head of our government put forward the theory that systems all throughout the United States had been turned against him to steal an election, and that in fact we should ignore the evidence of these systems working correctly and instead follow behind him. And it was a call that led a group of people to actual physical insurrection. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about it in part because one of the terms that I end up using in this book is the idea of insurrectionism, which I'm using in a very different way than what occurred at the Capitol on January 6th. But I should say that this is a book that I've been working on for a while. It was not intended to be a book about Donald Trump. When I started writing the book, Trump was a washed-up reality television star. I was actually writing about very different sorts of political revolutions. I was really interested in a wave of protest movements that we saw earlier in the last decade, things like Podemos, things like the Occupy movement, and things like this particular little protest movement that I was studying for a little bit in Ghana, a country where I've spent a lot of time. So these are people out in the streets of Accra. They are part of a protest movement called Dumsor. Dumsor is a Twi word. It means on and off. And what people are protesting in Dumsor is the power going on and off. Ghana has become a middle-income nation. Lots of people have air conditioners, TVs, things like that. The power grid that Ghana built in the 1970s is not capable of coping with that sort of load. And so you've had consumer protests. Why are we having these rolling blackouts? And so I was in Accra a few years back, and I cornered this handsome guy above my head, a guy named Efo Dela. Dela is a programmer and a blogger. He's also a poet and a comedian and kind of a Twitter personality. And I follow his Twitter feed, and I'd seen that he had helped organize a march of about 5,000 people to come out into the streets to protest these power cuts. And so we were hanging out, and I said, hey, what are the technologies that people are using in Ghana for political organizing? Do you organize on Twitter? Do you organize on Facebook? Is it WhatsApp? What is it? He said, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm not political. Now, usually when I'm in a different country and someone says this to me, it means shut up before we both get arrested. But that's not what AFO meant. Ghana is a very politically stable and open society. There's really no danger in throwing a protest like this. He actually meant something really different. What he meant was, as a young Ghanaian, as a cultural influencer, if someone thought that he was affiliated with either of Ghana's two main political parties, they would assume that he was an idiot. And he didn't want to be associated as someone who was associated with formal politics. In fact, the next thing he said to me was, dude, I don't even let someone who's political take a photo with me. So I realized in talking to IFO that this was something that I was hearing from my own students. I wrote most of this book when I was over at MIT running a lab called the Center for Civic Media. And my students, almost to a one, were activists. But also, almost to a one, they had almost nothing to do with formal politics. They ended up feeling like many of those political systems were so broken that there was no way that they were going to be able to have any influence within them. In many cases, they were actually suspicious of kind of the legacy of protests that had led towards change in the United States. We talked a lot about the role of the civil rights movement in the United States in sort of establishing what it means to be a political participant and sort of the methods put forward by Dr. King and so many other leaders of the civil rights movement. And what I ended up finding over time was a skepticism that change could happen in the same way that it happened in the US in the 1960s. Now, the typical response to this is to say that young people are dumb. They don't know what's going on. They have, as people often say, low civic knowledge. We don't teach civics in the schools. Maybe the answer is they need to go back to the 1980s where we all grew up on Schoolhouse Rock. I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill, and it's sitting here on Capitol Hill. But I decided to kind of examine the other theory in this, which is maybe they've actually got a point. Maybe it is hard to make change in some of the same ways that our parents learned how to make change, that we've been taught sort of change happens in America and in other open societies. So I started trying to figure out what might be different for my students in 2020 from sort of the model of social change that I grew up on growing up in the 1970s and 1980s. And I started stumbling upon this graph. So this graph is a measure of a question that sociologists ask the American populace a couple times a year. And frankly, I've been asking the American public a couple times a year since the late 1950s. And the question is, do you trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time? And what's interesting is when you asked people this question in the 1960s, the answer was an overwhelming yes. This number peaks in 1964 during the Kennedy administration at 77%. So almost 4 in 5 Americans have trust in government. Now, by the way, since we're doing this, with Africana Studies professor in this, we should note that if people were pulling apart those polls and polling white Americans and Black Americans, you might get very different answers. In fact, we have always seen when we pull apart these numbers that Black Americans have lower confidence in government. It actually changes briefly during Obama, but it's a blip in this much, much larger series of things. But an overall number of Americans, a vast majority of Americans, are expressing trust in government in the 1960s. And then we have the 1970s. And through Nixon, Ford, and Carter, we slide down from this peak of sort of 77% down to 26%, where you're down around 1 in 4 Americans having a lot of trust in government. It has oscillated since then, but it's really never gone up to those 1960s levels. We have this very brief war bump right after 9/11. George W. Bush crosses 50% confidence, but then we fall down. And frankly, all through Obama, Trump, and I'm willing to bet once this is done with polling under Biden, all through Obama and Trump, we've been under 20%. We've been at extremely low levels of confidence in government. So fair enough. A lot of political scientists agree that American government is perhaps uniquely screwed up at the moment, that we have not adapted our system to deal with rising levels of partisanship. But what's interesting is it's not just the government in which Americans have lost trust. In fact, Gallup polls Americans on a very wide range of social institutions. And while some of those government institutions like Congress, rate absolute at the bottom of this, what's interesting is virtually every institution in American public life has lost public confidence since the 1970s. So looking at this, the only institutions that grow in confidence are small business, not an institution by my definition. I'm sort of defining institutions as bureaucracies, entities, things where it's not about the person who runs them, it's about the rules of the organization. Institutions are sort of something without a face. So small business, maybe the bar owner or the restaurant owner, put that up for the moment. The only institution that increases in confidence is the military. And frankly, that has a lot to do with the fact that they started polling during the Vietnam War. But having increased confidence in the military is not actually what you want in a democracy, right? Like that's what you expect out of Egypt. That's not necessarily good news. You go down the rest of the list, the police, the church, organized religion, the medical system, the public schools, banks, newspapers, criminal justice system, televised news. Trust in all of these decreases. And in some of them, it collapses. There's 80% trust in the medical system in 1975. That number is down to 37% when this graph is put together in 2015. It's probably lower now, thanks to both the anti-vax movement and our handling of COVID. It's also not just the US. There's a great set of studies done by the public relations firm Edelman. They go out, they survey people in countries around the world. They actually do something that's really smart in your survey research. They break apart general population and elite population. General population, by the way, is almost always more trusting. Your elites are almost always more skeptical. But what we know from this research is that the US, until pretty recently, was kind of in the middle of the trust pack. We've now fallen into the low part of the trust pack. But generally speaking, we are a reasonably trusting nation in terms of trust in institutions. There are nations that are far more mistrustful than we are, including France, Spain, Italy, Japan, the UK. So it is not just a US thing. It is not just uniquely what's going on in our country. It has something to do with a larger moment of societal dissatisfaction with how systems are working. And one of the papers that's really made this clear is from Stefan Foa and Sascha Munk. And this was a paper that came out in 2017. It's one of those weird papers that came out in the New York Times before it actually came out in a peer-reviewed journal because it was so shocking. But what they did was take data that was actually pretty well known and pretty well established. It was data from the World Values Survey, which is a very common sociology instrument. And it was a new way of looking at a question. The question asks, do you think it's essential to live in a democracy? And if you ask people who were born in the 1930s in the United States, 75% of them say that it's essential to live in a democracy. By the time you get to the 1970s, when I'm born, you've got people who are down much closer to 35%. It drops close to 25% as you get down to people living in the 1980s. And people have reacted to this with a great deal of concern. after the sort of triumphalism of post-Cold War, capitalism and liberal democracy is the only way to go, why are we now seeing people essentially saying maybe it's not necessary to live in a democracy, even in countries that seem to be doing democracy reasonably well, like New Zealand or Sweden? So this finding of reduced institutional trust is pretty robust. And it's pretty surprising. It's actually something that happens at the same time that interpersonal trust is fairly constant. So even while we see this sort of generational shift in whether we trust in democracy or whether we trust in these institutions, if you ask people interpersonal trust questions like, can most people be trusted, or you can never be so careful, those numbers are far more stable than these institutional trust numbers. And so the paradox is sort of, why would be losing trust in institutions and not in individuals? And some of the ideas that people put forward, one is that we may just be better educated. When we roll back to the 1960s, many Americans are not finishing high school. A tiny percentage are going on to college. So the sort of critical thinking that, perhaps we take for granted in the general population. In fact, we should remember, people graduating with BAs are only about 35% of the US population at the moment, or not graduating year by year. But if we take the US population as a whole, you're only at about 35% BA holders. You're going from an incredibly low level of people who've had higher ed, a lot of critical thinking, to a much, much higher level. And it's possible that as education is increasing, we're getting a more mistrustful population. The trick with this is it doesn't really explain high trust nations that have lower levels of education. It also doesn't explain in highly educated nations why some countries have much higher trust, like Germany or Scandinavia, and the US and Spain and France have much lower trust. There's a lot of people who want to blame this on social media, right? You can now write whatever you want. We can have misinformation, disinformation. Obviously, that changes everything. The problem with that as an explanation is it doesn't help us explain the shift in the 1970s. Maybe it helps us with the last 10 years where social media has become really dominant. There is a more sophisticated version of that hypothesis that says, look, journalism actually changed a lot in the 1970s. You have Watergate, you have a much more aggressive press. And maybe that combination of an aggressive investigative press followed by social media simply puts us in a place to hold power to account in a very different way. Unfortunately, I like this explanation better. One of the things that we see start to rise in the 1970s is inequality. And in fact, if you're just aligning curves, you can see growing inequality and falling trust happening almost simultaneously. And that's something that actually makes a good deal of sense. If our system, the overall system, not just of government, but the economic system, the welfare system, if it is failing more people, you would expect people to be losing faith in those institutions, and the timelines align. And we know from Thomas Piketty and other work that the levels of inequality that we are seeing are really unprecedented in recent history. Although once you go back to the 1920s, you find yourself at those moments. There are interesting questions about if inequality is directly connected, do we see the political instability of the early 20th century sort of following this? Honestly, probably the easiest answer to all of this is people lose trust in institutions when they fail. Americans had very high trust in the church until the Catholic sex scandals. And then you can see trust plummet. Americans had quite high trust in the medical system until we moved over to HMOs as our main way of delivering healthcare, and people started fighting a bureaucracy rather than interacting with their local doctor. It's quite possible that when we have failures of institutions, for instance, our failures to deal with COVID under the previous presidency, you end up with real attacks on trust. So why does this matter? Trust matters because it's really hard to coordinate at scale if we don't have an institution that we can all sort of agree on. So looking at COVID is actually a nice way to look at why mistrust can be so dangerous societally. Taiwan is only 100 miles from China. A million of Taiwan's 22 million residents live in mainland China. Everybody expected Taiwan to get flooded with deaths from COVID. But Taiwan's government at the moment is incredibly popular and is really widely open to citizen input. And their reaction to COVID has been sort of amazing in their open source work on this. Taiwan masked up almost immediately. They had a shortage of masks. A private citizen wrote an app to let people sort of crowdsource mask reports. You could say, hey, I was in this pharmacy, they have extra masks, go there. The government within 48 hours said, this is great. Could we please just run this for you and take over the server hosting bills? And there's a whole bunch of stories like this with Taiwan being out in front, embracing citizen input, doing all the things that you would want to see. And their reward has been almost zero COVID deaths. Brazil is a pretty clear example of the other way to handle this. You've had Jair Bolsonaro refer to COVID as gripezinha, a little flu. He, much like Donald Trump, was a COVID denier, is a COVID denier, ended up getting the disease. Brazil is now only behind the US in terms of COVID cases and deaths. So having low trust in government's competency to do these things, or particularly governments that tell you don't trust us to deal with this, it can have very real impacts. But what I was really writing about in the Mistrust book was this idea that mistrust creates a crisis in civics. So we're sort of taught that there's two major ways to be civically engaged. You can go to the polls and you can elect someone and they'll go into office and you try to influence them once they're in office. And this is how we make change. And in cases where we can't do that, we can't make change through those mechanisms, we can always take to the streets and protest. But one of the interesting things is that if the goal of your protest is not to overthrow the government and replace it with something else, that's what's going on in the sunflower protests here in Taiwan. If your goal is to just influence the government, it takes two to tango. If we think about the history of protest, in many cases, we are thinking about moments like the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. leads a march in part because President Kennedy has signaled that he needs public pressure to go ahead and push for a civil rights agenda. In cases where protesters are pushing on a government they don't trust to do anything, protest has a very different function. It's more of an expressive function. It's more of an organizing function. It's more of inchoate rage. You think about something like the Women's March the day after Trump's inauguration. No one thought that taking to the streets would actually make Trump less of a misogynist. There was another theory of change behind it. It's a much less direct, instrumental way of doing things. So I'm really interested in this question of what happens if people feel frustrated. They feel like there's no path through conventional civic participation. There might be no path through protest. The real danger of this is what you end up with is disengagement. And this is what we've seen in very low trust societies like Russia, sort of a sense that none of these institutions work, they're all entirely corrupt, and you're an idiot to play the game. The other thing that seems to come up in many cases is demagogues, an individual who says, yep, don't trust the system, just trust me personally. I'm going to find a way through this. So in this book, what I really got interested in is saying, what can we do to help people feel effective as citizens, even at a moment of incredibly high trust in institutions? And so I borrowed a pair of terms from Chris Hayes, from an excellent book that he wrote about 10 years ago, Twilight of the Elites. He talks about American politics as being best understood, not just in terms of left and right, but in terms of institutionalist and insurrectionist. And my guess is that he regrets those terms. I regret borrowing them after January 6th, but there's a reason to use them. They actually have a very specific meaning. For him, institutionalists are people who want progress through strong institutions. They want good people to go into politics. They want good people to go into business. They believe that the way to make change is to join struggling institutions and make them stronger. Insurrectionists look at this and say, have you looked at those institutions lately? They are broken. And we either need a fundamental change to them, or we need entirely new institutions in their place, or the really radical ones, maybe we need no institution at all. And so the way that sort of using Hayes's terms, I would sort of break up American politics. In 2016, we had Hillary Clinton, who is a left institutionalist, right? You know, out of the State Department, out of a political career all of her life, knows how to work within the institutions, make them work for herself. She thought she would be running against a right institutionalist, someone like Jeb Bush. She got blindsided by a right insurrectionist in Donald Trump, someone who said the institutions, they don't matter, you can't trust any of them, just trust me, that's the way to go. There is a very strong insurrectionist bent on both the left and on the right in American politics right now. Bernie Sanders, whether or not he is, I mean, you have to argue that someone who spent that much of his life in government has at least something of an institutional streak, is positioning himself as an insurrectionist from the left. So these folks can be right and insurrectionists. These folks can be left and insurrectionists. One of the things that I find myself reminding people when I present this work is that the Occupy Wall Street movement, classic insurrectionist movement, wasn't willing to put forward specific legislative demands because they felt like there was so much about modern capitalism and representative democracy that was broken. That happened during the Obama administration. So there's efforts at insurrectionism that are coming from the left and are essentially saying these institutions are not working or not working well for us. So I end up suggesting that people who are, so this is a book in taking insurrectionists seriously. And I end up suggesting that you see sort of three common insurrectionist models. You see the radical institutionalist who is willing to go into the institution, but wants to bring it back to its original or core values. This is not someone who's going into an institution for incremental change. They're going into an institution for very profound structural change of that institution. There's counter-democracy. This is a term I'm stealing from the French philosopher Pierre Rosanvallon, contre-democracy, who suggests that institutions depend on counter-institutions. You have to push against them to make them stronger. And then finally, looking at this very fashionable term of disruption, the people who want to bulldoze over the institutions and replace them with something else. So I end up talking about things like the progressive prosecutor movement. This is a really interesting movement in the US where people are moving into the DA's office and very explicitly saying, look, this job is not about incarcerating people. That's the wrong way to think about this. This job ultimately is about social justice. And at the end of the day, sometimes perhaps justice comes from locking somebody up. But given the racial disparities in our correction system and our criminal justice system, often what justice actually comes from is drug treatment, restitution, finding different ways to bring a community together. And Larry Krasner is one of the better examples of this. He's the DA in Philadelphia. One of his first acts in taking that job was essentially saying, we're not going to put people away for marijuana anymore. We're not going to put people away for prostitution anymore. And by the way, there is a whole set of police officers who we are no longer even going to use as witnesses in cases because we can see from their record that their vision of their job is incarcerating people, not actually achieving societal justice. So this is a quiet movement. It doesn't get a ton of attention, but it's a classic radical institutionalist movement. It's looking at an institution and saying, look, we've lost sight of what our original goal was. And I'm going to try to figure out from within this institution how to bring it back to that original goal. I mentioned the counter Democrats. Their weapon is watchfulness. It's looking at institutions, calling them out when they're not working well. What's funny is that sometimes these outsiders, these institutions that are sort of monitoring from the outside, can actually show us when institutions are working well. One of my favorite examples in the book is a project called Monothon. This is done by a friend of mine in Italy named Luigi Reggi. Luigi is interested in this idea that people want to be involved with civic life. They want to participate in things like hackathons, but a lot of them can't code. So he came up with this idea of a monothon. It's a monitoring hackathon. You can go out and investigate whether a place in Italy that's being built with EU cohesion funds is actually spending the money well, or whether it is, as everyone perceives, corrupt. And this is now part of the high school curriculum in Italy. Actually, it's part of your civics curriculum, is to go out and monitor EU spending on local projects. And what it's actually doing is increasing confidence within the system. Sometimes monitoring is monitoring of systems that we know are broken. And so projects like Copwatch, that builds on the Black Panther tradition of patrolling the police, of actually following police around and taping and watching arrests, that's where counter democracy can get very, very powerful in trying to expose where institutions are really not living up to what they're trying to do. And then finally, we are seeing people suggesting that situations exist where, in some cases, not in every case, but in some cases, an institution is broken and really needs to be rethought of from the ground up. And this is something that I think is very interesting about a movement like Defund the Police. There have been movements to reform and incrementally change the relationship between communities of color and the police in many cities that have simply not worked. And we may have reached a point of generational mistrust in this institution where the only way to do things is to reduce spending on that institution and start building parallel public safety institutions that are unarmed and that are born out of the community and that are working on those problems, because right now making change within the system is not working well for those communities. So I also try to talk about strategies that activists can kind of take at a moment where I think making change through law can feel very challenging. And here I build on work done by my friend Larry Lessig. Lessig, in this book from 2000, suggests that there's four basic ways that societies regulate themselves, right? We have laws. You can't drive 100 miles an hour. We will arrest you and put you in jail. But we also have norms. You drive slowly and politely through a town, in part because it's the nice thing to do, and people are going to think you're a jerk if otherwise. I usually use the example that, no one jumps up and starts shouting at me during my lectures. But of course, now that we're on Zoom and you're in a webinar, you can't actually do it anyway. So it's no longer a good norms example. But we have found out that norms are an enormous social constraint. Lessa goes on and says, look, we can use markets to control societies. We make things expensive, we make them cheap. If you're a smoker and watch the price of cigarettes go up over the last 20 years, that's a way of market pressures trying to change behavior. Lessig's big breakthrough was to say that code, technical systems, architectures, technologies can also govern what you can and can't do. And he has lots of examples of, if you put a CD into your computer wants to make MP3s from it. But if you put a DVD in your computer, it locks down and won't let you copy it. I am reliably told by my students that at this point, they no longer know what CDs or DVDs are. So I don't know quite how to give that example. But code examples, code changing how the built physical world works, can also be understood with things like curb cuts. If you want to open spaces up to people in wheelchairs, you actually have to change the physical architecture so that they can come up off the street onto a sidewalk and up a ramp and into a building. Those are the sorts of architectural structural changes that Lessig means by code. So one of the things that I do in the book is kind of suggest that if you turn this inside out, you actually end up with kind of a handbook for contemporary activism. If you're having a hard time making change through law because you feel like Congress is stuck, it's broken, it's very hard to influence, there are ways to make change in other ways. So, for instance, for the last 4 years, we have been very much stuck in terms of making legal change at the federal level around addressing climate change. But we've also seen an enormous number of market based efforts to try to deal with climate. Now, whether giving Elon Musk your money is the best way to deal with climate change isn't clear, but the rise of the electric car, the rise of rooftop solar, these are market based ways in which individuals can try to find a way to make a change, even when it's hard to make a change through law. Another place where there has not been a lot of momentum is around privacy. Even with Ed Snowden's discoveries during the Obama administration, there was not a lot of momentum for protecting privacy and identity from the NSA and other agencies like that. But you sometimes have unique individuals. This is Moxie Marlinspike. Marlinspike wrote the core code for Whisper Systems, which is behind the Signal messaging app. That would have been very powerful technology by itself for people to have communications that are very hard for the NSA to tap. But then he managed to persuade the founders of WhatsApp to build it into their software. So here's sort of one guy committed to privacy who, through writing a small amount of code, is able to really change the landscape for more than 1 billion users of WhatsApp software. And this is why the code model is so powerful. In markets, you get other people to pay you to make change. In code, if you're in the right place, you might be able to make change, from a point of what looks like very little leverage. But if you can get it into key systems, maybe you can make major social change. I don't want to make the argument that we are done making change through law. Obviously, making change through law, as during the civil rights movement, is in many ways the most secure way of getting social change. And there are cases like the Oberfelge decision where we have seen law on the side of very positive social change. But I want to argue that these days, legal change has a lot to do with change in norms. So let's go back in history. One of the really critical moments in the civil rights movement is Loving versus Virginia. This is the case that legalizes marriage between Black and white Americans. What's really interesting is if you go back and look at the polling, Americans have no interest in this going on. In 1967, fewer than 20% of Americans are in favor of interracial marriage. But the Supreme Court looks at this and says, nope, sorry, these are two people, they have the right to get married. Society may not be ready for this yet, but we, as arbiters of the American legal system, we see the wrong here. We're going to push in that direction. Let's compare to the Oberfelge case. By the time Oberfelge is settled in 2015, 60% of Americans believe in equal marriage for gay and lesbian couples. And this is a huge shift. It's a shift that's happening over a long period of time. Down in 96, you're down at almost, Loving versus Virginia levels of people willing to make this change. What happens between 96 and 2015 is cultural campaigns. We have the normalization of gay and lesbian identities. We have figures showing up on television and in film and in all of our lives. And we get to this point where a norms-based change makes that law change possible. And so one of the things I'm really interested right now is that I think norms-based activism may actually in some cases precede key sort of legal changes that need to happen. And that's one of the reasons why I am so fascinated right now with movements like Me Too and particularly Black Lives Matter, because they are very explicitly saying, yes, there are laws that need to change, but even more than that, there is a set of beliefs and attitudes that need to change. One of the case studies that I use in my book looks at a campaign around Mike Brown's death. And the campaign is put together by a guy who's become a good friend in the course of writing this story. His name is C.J. Lawrence. He's a lawyer in Birmingham, Alabama. He's now become a social entrepreneur, but he reacts to the use of this photo on the left of the screen of Mike Brown, flashing a peace sign, looking tough, looking hard, and sort of says, why is this the photo that is being shown of Mike Brown? You know, I'm seeing two photos of Mike Brown. I'm either seeing his corpse in the street, or I'm seeing this photo that looks very carefully chosen to make him look like a thug. This photo is also in his photo stream on Facebook. He looks like a kid, and he's an 18-year-old kid when he gets shot. If they gun me down, which picture would the media use? And this campaign goes incredibly viral. There are tens of thousands of participants in the first 3 days of it. The New York Times, 3 days into it, writes about the campaign on the front page. We actually know that the campaign worked because we can look at the photo evidence of how Mike Brown gets portrayed. And that first photo of him standing on his porch is almost invisible when we look at Mike Brown. In fact, that pairing is someone making this case, making this argument. Generally speaking, we get the graduation photo, we get Mike Brown not in that portrayal. This is not something that undoes Brown's murder. This is not something that brings us to racial justice tomorrow, but it is something that is important when we're doing norms-based change. Changing the media, changing how people are portrayed has everything to do with how those campaigns work. It's also important because it shows that people can actually have an effect. This pattern of how victims of police violence end up being portrayed in the media is one that many Black activists noted and were able to call out and mobilize people around. And we are now seeing change. And that change over time helps change how we look at victims of police violence. It's not possible to say the reaction to George Floyd comes from a campaign like this one, but the social shifts brought around by Black Lives Matter have to do with why George Floyd's death becomes a moment of galvanization, following on from Mike Brown's. So where the book ends up is really this. I don't care at the end of the day whether I persuaded you to be an institutionalist or an insurrectionist. I think there are valid ways to work inside, outside, or to build new institutions. I don't think it's a matter of sort of choosing these levers. I actually think using these levers of law, code, markets, and norms together is the most effective way to make change. What I want to see is us rethink civics around efficacy. People need to know that they can change the world for the better, because this moment of high mistrust is really dangerous. And what we saw on January 6th is that mistrust, and in this case, mistrust that's been weaponized, that's been used specifically to mislead people and bring them out into the street, is fuel that could actually burn down our democracy. But I also think that it's fuel that could be channeled into new forms of social change that can be incredibly powerful and effective. So that's the rough outline of the book. I'm really hoping I've left enough time for conversation, and maybe I've provoked you or pissed you off or any of those things, so that we can have that conversation. I always, when I go to stop my slides, I almost end up leaving the meeting, which would be a bit of a mic drop in this case. So I'm glad that I succeeded in not doing that. But thank you for hanging in and for listening. And Neil, I'd love to have a conversation with you about this.
Yeah. This is wonderful. First of all, just thank you for that very intellectually rich conversation. And so for those kind of who are with us, we want to invite you to submit questions in the Q&A function. There are some there now, but feel free to add those if you haven't had a chance. And if you don't mind, maybe, because there's so much that you showed that I wanted to actually ask you about, because you make this very persuasive case, both not only philosophically but also empirically in terms of the trends, right?
Yeah.
And not only within the U.S. context but also internationally. And you make the persuasive case of kind of citizens and everyday people losing trust in institutions. But what I was really interested about is can there not be a simultaneous mistrust of institutions while perhaps we might trust one another outside of institutions? So what most immediately comes to mind is Texas.
Mhm.
So, right, just as a reminder, right, everyone recollecting that not too long ago, the state of Texas had a snowstorm that in Williamstown standards, Berkshire County, Massachusetts standards, would be, even during a pandemic, no reason to have any closures. But in the state of Texas, that then, given that the state has its own particular grids, speaking of grids, led to kind of mass power outages. The grocery stores were empty in many parts of the state, and communities of color, Black and Latinx in particular, though not exclusively, were asymmetrically affected. And what was really fascinating, speaking of the via media, was in cries for help and critiques of the Texas governor as a representative of you break down the idea of institutions, government, big business, the healthcare system, the press, but the governor of Texas as representative of kind of government. Um,
Sure.
the kind of proliferation of kind of calls for mutual aid societies. I would consider them as mutual aid societies as mutual trust. So in terms of not merely donating, but what does it mean to actually then give, whether you're in the state of Texas at the time or not, to these mutual aid organizations, which essentially are the citizens having a mistrust in the state government, but not a mistrust in one another. So in terms of for your, you gave us a really wonderful typology, and I know there's a lot of case studies you didn't even get to, but could you just talk
Yeah, yeah.
that example as an example of not just mistrusting government, movements mistrusting government, and then that eventually perhaps leading to change, but is there a simultaneity of mistrust in
Yep. Yep.
institutions but trust in one another? That's my question.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say a couple of things out of the situation in Texas. Texas. I'll start by saying that I'm partnered to a Houstonian, so we were watching very, very closely, because not only was Houston very, very hard hit, but it's a city that's sort of hard hit again and again and again, with flooding, with sort of other crises. Um, so all throughout the pandemic, moves towards mutual aid have been springing up, right? We've seen incredibly slow congressional action. We've seen a lot of people, particularly in urban areas, trying to do mutual aid, particularly around food and sort of providing basics of economics. Um, in terms of the empirical numbers, we have seen interpersonal trust. So the question that's usually asked in the World Values Survey is, can you trust most people or you never can be too careful? And Americans have slid from like 55, you can trust most people, down to maybe 45. It's not the dramatic slide that we've had in institutions. It is something of a slide, but particularly when you talk to people about what they trust more,
Yeah.
they certainly trust their neighbors more. They certainly trust their local community, their church. They even trust their local government more. So things that they can interact with and they can see people behind. So to the extent that mutual aid ends up being helpful, I
Mhm.
think it's this notion of you're trusting in people like you to do the right thing and to help out. But there's another funny story that happens in Texas. And the New York Times actually wrote about this, but I was kind of watching this because I have friends who work for this company.
Yeah.
HEB, which is the local grocery chain through Texas, sort of emerged as Texas's FEMA,
Yeah.
and ended up giving out a huge amount of aid, opening stores as sort of warming centers and shelters. And this is something that we also see, which is that when one institution fails, other institutions sometimes step up.
Mhm.
You may have experienced this. Last year in March, I think we were all trying to figure out, is it safe to go out in public? Is it safe to travel? What do we do? The institution that finally told me what to do was my employer. It was MIT. And
Mhm.
MIT said, sorry, prof, you are no longer teaching classes in public and you are no longer allowed to get on an airplane. And my response was, well, geez, thank God somebody said it, because the federal government wasn't going to go ahead and do it. there's much worse outcomes of that. My classmate Kurt Shaw studies urban poverty in Recife, Brazil, and he has been sending me videos of the ways in which street gangs in Brazilian favelas are taking advantage of COVID to sort of consolidate control and territory. And one of their weapons is organizing COVID lockdowns. So what they're basically saying is, because the Brazilian government won't take care of you in the favelas, we will lock you down. And they have a certain amount of legitimacy in as much as the main authorities are not actually addressing the pandemic and the deaths that are sort of coming from it. So the good news is, when an institution fails, maybe we rely on each other. The bad news is, when an institution fails, we often rely on whoever else will step up and try to pick up the slack at that moment.
Yeah, really fascinating. I'm going to bring in the kind of audience questions
Yeah.
to here, and then we can, you can respond, and then, certainly kind of join in as well. And so uh, one participant asks, are trust in institutions related to whether we are at war or at peace? So very direct, short.
Yeah, and it's a great question. I have to say, it's not one that I had thought about. I think my first instinct would be to say that nations generally go to war. Individuals don't necessarily go to war, but of course that's not always true. One of the things that states have is supposedly a monopoly on violence, and so the hope would be that a government can come in and sort of say, "Hey, we're not going to let this local dispute escalate to the point where people are killing each other. We have the legitimacy of the state and the legitimacy of the military to sort of take these things over." So the sort of long-haired peacenik in me wants to say, well, if the governments don't involve, maybe we'll just have peace. The guy who spent a lot of years studying conflict in West Africa, would respond and say, actually, having a trusted state that can come in and sort of say, whoa, we've got to find a different way to solve this, rather than a violent resolution of conflict. So I do think state institutions have a role in peace. I think what state institutions have maybe more of a role in, trusted institutions, is human welfare. I think institutions are most important because they help us distribute resources to groups of people where they may be distributed unequally, and they allow us to accomplish things that are hard for us to accomplish individually. Institutions are important when we're trying to create public goods, when we're trying to do something like an educated populace that's really hard for all of us to do individually. And so my argument would be, a society that is better educated, more healthy, is going to be more peaceful in the long run. So I think they're definitely connected there.
There's another question. This Tom D93. So I don't know if that's class of '93 or just a Unix.
I'm guessing it's class of '93. I sort of shouted out to the Facebook group, and there's a few folk in the audience here who I know are '93ers. There's some older folk here, like Joe Cruz, who is 91, and I see all. I'm grateful for having you here. But let's go to Tom's question.
Yeah. So Tom writes, Ethan, great talk. I'm curious to hear about your views on the role of conspiracy theories. I think it's interesting. Conspiracy theories, which seem more widespread today than before the rise of social media, although they have enjoyed a rich history in America. So to the question, how do you think of the relationship between conspiracy theories and mistrust?
Yeah, Tom, thank you for this one. I've been writing about this topic for the last couple of years because, I study the internet, and that means I study QAnon. And I wrote a piece about a year and a half back that kind of slipped away without a trace at the moment, and now people are coming back to now, called QAnon and the Birth of the Unreal. There have always been conspiracy theories in American history. They are usually, as people say, weapons of the weak, right? They're normally embraced by people who are disempowered in one fashion or another. The thing that's been so different is that we had a conspiracy theorist in the White House. And so we suddenly had conspiracy theories supporting the consolidation of power. And then with what people are now calling the big lie, the quote unquote stop the steal, we saw conspiracy theories about election fraud become part of the Republican Party platform. And that's terrifying. That's really strange because conspiracy theories on these levels basically require you to sort of fork reality. You end up sort of saying, either I believe the New York Times, CNN, the governors of all of these different states, so on and so forth, or I believe that they're all in on it, and I have to have my own closed epistemology where, Fox News is as far left as I get, but OANN, Breitbart, sort of that whole media ecosystem is simply seeing a different world. And, one version of this basically says you create another reality because you want to live in that reality. And of course, Donald Trump wants to live in a reality where he won an election in a landslide. But there's a much deeper level to this. I end up writing in the book about a whole bunch of scholars of contemporary Russia. I mostly focus on a guy named Peter Pomerantsev, who's just a terrific author. And their theories are basically, if you pretend nothing is true, if you sort of persuade everybody that everybody lies, everybody has a secret agenda, you can't trust anything, what you basically do is you paralyze people. You no longer know what's worth working towards. You no longer know what's worth advocating for. And so you just look at who's in power, because obviously they figured out a way to sort of, run the system and sort of live on top of it. So I'm taking a lot of my cues about conspiracy theories from Peter, from Masha Gessen, from Anne Applebaum, a lot of these folks who are looking at Russia, looking at how disinformation has been used under Putin, and looking at the political advantages of it. The one other thing that I would say is that we have actually started to see social media pushback, and it wasn't political, it was health-based. So something, again, kind of quiet but remarkable happened this summer. This video called Plandemic, which basically said, not only is COVID-19 fake, it was personally created by Anthony Fauci for him to make money, and the worst thing you can do is put on a mask, it's going to kill you. And it circulated for less than 48 hours, and the platforms were like, nah, we're committed to open speech, but this is a terrible idea, and we're taking this down. And it's actually been a sea change, right? Donald Trump's deplatforming, you can draw a direct line from that health misinfo into those sort of political decisions. So absolutely, there's a huge amount of disinformation. The social networks are definitely aggravating it, but you can't just fight misinformation technically. You've got to deal with the fact that it's now part of the Republican Party. The tech people are now actually starting to take it seriously instead of tone it down. We now have to deal with it as an explicit political strategy in America.
Um, that last question and also your response really brings to mind what I take to be a distinction we can think of between fact and truth.
Yeah.
If fact could be kind of objective, and truth is, because you introduced to us this idea, right, that norms, kind of normalizing precedes the law. So if you can kind of make truth is kind of manufactured, then it gives more kind of credence to it, and particularly a work that I think is long overlooked, W.E.B. Du Bois's 1935 work, Black Reconstruction in America, is this long chapter at the end, right? The propaganda of history. And so much of, even alternative facts is kind of this idea of manufactured truth and giving credence to these kind of theories that then become adopted. And so I think a lot of what you're talking about has this ramifications for how do we think of trust and mistrust on that very point. I'm gonna, in terms of, since questions are starting to come in, I'm gonna maybe kind of give you a couplet at a time.
And I'll try to shorten them down too.
Yeah, no, and this is wonderful. I think we can actually do it. We have time for the kind of couplet. So I'll do kind of one couplet now. The first is coming from Jean-Louis Huard, who asks, in co-creating a shift in paradigm, how would, I believe what they meant to say is, how would designing perhaps a new social network increase political participation to enable meaningful change on the one hand? And then the second question, in a different direction, but still related, what about diversity and or lack of representation as drivers of mistrust? For example, the Scandinavian countries until recently, were fairly homogeneous, and perhaps does that contribute to the relatively high trust in institutions? So this
Yeah, yeah,
networks, and then is
right.
homogeneity or heterogeneity affecting how we think about mistrust?
Yeah, so let's do diversity first. There was a lot of theorizing that maybe homogeneity was really essential to get people to support public goods, basically, and that's going to come up in Kay Morrissey's question.
Mhm.
The willingness to sort of invest in society. So this was the argument that people always made about Scandinavia. Of course, they can have a big welfare system. They're ethnically homogeneous. People are willing to give money to people who look like them. The counter to that is Japan, which is an incredibly low institutional trust society. And that has to do, I think, with some very stale institutions that are not doing a good job of adapting to modernity. It has a lot to do with sexism. It has a lot to do with traditionalism that hasn't been willing to change. That's an incredibly homogeneous society, much more so than the Scandinavian countries. The other counter there would be Germany, which is a very high trust society, but has been enjoying huge levels of immigration for quite some time. And despite having a very large Turkish population, now a large Syrian Arab population, actually seems to be doing very, very well in trust. So I actually think trust and diversity can go together. I think it probably has more to do with how well the institutions function. Um, the question about redesigning social networks is so in my wheelhouse. I'm worried people are going to think that I planted it. The reason, there's a lot of reasons I left MIT, but in coming to UMass, what I have said that I want to do there is start working on social networks that work very, very differently from the ones that we have right now. And the main change that I want to make is that I actually think trying to design social networks for 2 billion people is crazy. We don't have communities that work for 2 billion people. We have communities that work for 20, maybe 200. If you work really hard, you can turn maybe 2,000 into a community. 20,000, you'd better have some sort of governance in place. So I'm really interested in building social networks that are small, interconnected. You belong to a whole bunch of them. You have different ones for different purposes. Um, and most critically, you govern them yourself. So rather than waiting for someone who works for Facebook as a contractor in the Philippines to open a 3-ring binder and figure out whether your speech is acceptable, you actually have those hard conversations within your own community about what's acceptable speech and what's acceptable behavior. Bob Putnam made this argument 25 years ago that we were losing our democratic capacity because we were no longer part of our neighborhood organizations and Elks clubs and so on and so forth. My friend Daniel Allen likes to point out that, those institutions were all, incredibly exclusive. They were almost always male only. They were often racially exclusive. But that sort of small d democracy of civic participation is probably a critical ingredient. And so the first thing that I would do in trying to rebuild networks to make these changes is to ask us to administer our own communities, ask us to take on that small d democratic work of figuring out how do we treat each other well, how do we decide the norms and the practices of our speech. If you want to see more of where I'm going with this, you can look at publicinfrastructure.org. I have a bunch of papers up about this notion of digital public infrastructure, this idea that we might actually want to spend public money to build these new sorts of social networks to help us be better small d Democrats.
Wonderful. And that point also, your kind of collaboration and reasons with Daniel Allen, so kind of which public spheres are we talking about, and which civic civil society organizations are we talking about, and that is really important. Because Kay Morrissey has a fairly nuanced question, I'll kind of read that out and then return to it. So Kay Morrissey states, "It occurs to me that part of the explanation for mistrust in institutions could stem from what you just said. The institutions are a means for redistribution of resources to those left out. Is it possible that mistrust of institutions arose as the institutions of government strayed further away from this purpose and became more about protecting the interests and power of ever smaller groups.
Oh, yeah, exactly, right? So a good chunk of the book is looking at Reaganism and Thatcherism, right? So essentially, the attack on the notion of public goods. So once we have this sort of moment where you have Reagan saying, government can't do anything right, government isn't the solution, it's too often the problem. And you have Thatcher in Britain essentially saying the government shouldn't be running institutions, we should let them go to the market. What you have in that process is, in many cases, a shift away from the notion of public good. And the philosopher I find most helpful on this, historian, is Tony Judd, whose books late in his life about the US and the UK are basically him mourning the loss of public goods and public ambition. Um, and one of the things that I'm saying in the book is that we tie our hands behind our backs, right? When we sort of decide that we don't want governments to build redistributive institutions, we're losing major tools out of our toolkit. Um, and we have folks, Mike Bloomberg, who's posting a question here, as someone who's been deeply involved with local government in Massachusetts. He knows full well that there's only so much that you can rely on the private sector to do. At a certain point, you need tax money, you need the notion of public good to make major changes of one fashion or another. So I think that's exactly right. And when I talk about rising inequality, what I'm actually talking about is not just the numerical inequality, it's the shift in government to essentially say government should do very, very little, and it certainly shouldn't work to make poor people less poor. It should work to, create this winner take all system that we're living within. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, wonderful. And so we're going to take a couple of questions, one from who you just mentioned, Mike Bloomberg, and the second from Sarah Lyle. Mike Bloomberg writes, are we at risk of becoming desensitized to viral stories? So, for instance, think of Ralph Northam scandal or any number of Trumps and how they received a ton of attention but phased out quickly. So is there a key to making viral stories stay or stick, and should we want that? So this kind of question of, are we becoming desensitized, and the key to it sticking? Second question from Sarah Lyle, who writes, do you think that changes that don't come from institutions are more precarious in any way? And what do you think is the most effective way to make change going forward, especially for young people? And I'd probably add as a writer too, that some sense extends the conversation after your formal presentation that we had in terms of thinking about, well, if there's mistrust of government institutions, then maybe we trust each other. But then if the agents of change are not institutions, right, then is there not merely a positive effect, but potentially a precarious
effect? So let's go with Mike first. Mike, I think the answer to your question is that we're exhausted, right? Like, we've just gone through 4 years of this crazy media cycle where stories just come up again and again and again, almost to get the last story off the agenda. And this is Trumpism, right? So I have been doing quantitative studies. It turns out that Obama, when he was president, was in about 8 to 10% of newspaper stories on average. Donald Trump was in 20 to 25%, and often more than that. But if you think about that, like, in your entire newspaper, 20 to 25% of stories involve Donald Trump, and the scandals and sort of all the different things about that. I think, honestly, we sort of don't know what's going on in media right now. We're in this period of almost recovery from this very, very strange 4 or 5 year period where Donald Trump was sort of dominating the media cycle. I think more than becoming accustomed to viral stories, it's more that everybody now wants to make things go viral. Like, we all understand that virality and what we used to call earned media, people writing about you rather than you paying them to write about, is one of the best ways to advocate for something, to sell something. So the war for attention just gets more and more intense, and it's more and more difficult to sort of break our way out of that. The second question, which was about precarity of change, I think the thing to say is that I am not a big believer that a world without institutions would be a better world. I am neither a traditional anarchist or an anarcho-syndicalist. I actually think institutions matter a ton. I think we understand from the Trump presidency how much strong institutions can matter. What I'm actually trying to argue is that many of our institutions are broken and not fit for purpose, and that we need to replace them with better institutions. What I would say is in, the tech field, we have seen the revolutionaries very quickly become institutions, right? 10 years ago, Google was this revolutionary new company that was changing what was bad about advertising. And now, 10 years later, Google is the big baddie, firing my friend Dr. Timnit Gebru for questioning, how AI models work. So it's very easy for successful revolutionaries to become institutions, and then we find ourselves reacting against those over time as well. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think that's a healthy progress. What I actually think is far more dangerous is sort of being in a situation where it is too dangerous to rebel against the institutions. Because institutions have a tendency to self-perpetuate. They become filled with people who like the way the organization and the structure works. They don't want it to change, even when it's failing them. We're having this conversation within a university setting. Universities are institutions. As much as a leader like Maud, can make a real difference in a place, Williams will still be Williams at the end of her presidency. It is more of an institutional memory than it is anything else. And certainly many students, queer students, students of color, have been pointing out that there are ways in which Williams still needs to adapt and still needs to change. Whether that's a revolutionary change, whether it's an evolutionary change, I'm not close enough to the campus to have any judgment about that right now. But institutions that are so brittle that they cannot change, those are the ones that end up experiencing revolutionary change, because they're not able to change and deal with a changing world. That's what ends up people saying, this institution doesn't work for me anymore, let's topple it and get rid of one. What I sort of hope is that one of the messages out of this is not don't work within institutions, but build institutions that are aware that they need to change, they need to evolve over time. Otherwise, they risk putting themselves in this situation where you need the revolutionary shift.
Well, we're in the kind of latter stages of this fascinating presentation and kind of Q&A session. And so, Ethan, I was really intrigued at your response, because what I was going to ask was circling back to where you ended your formal presentation by talking about, if I understood it, the kind of radical institutionalists, right? Counter democracy and disruption. Because I was curious to know, and to have our audience, viewing audience, know where you saw yourself, particularly, yes, because you're making the important point that that you're making a strong case that institutions matter. However, I could see someone saying, well, institutions matter, but the question becomes, in terms of faith in it, is the faith in, we want to kind of build, aspire in a moment of mistrust to build institutions that we can kind of trust? Or is it that institutions are, in some sense, instrumental, for lack of a better term? There's an instrumentalism to it. They serve an important role in our lives, but maybe some individuals don't and may never hold the promise that these institutions are going to be the sites of enabling our kind of freedom solely, or treating us with dignity solely, but they might be important. So I just was hoping to hear a little bit more. And then, yeah. Does it make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the right question to ask. And I like you personalizing it, right? So the first thing that I want to say is that what we need are institutions that are worthy of our trust. And there are institutions that are worthy of our trust, and they're inclusive institutions, and they listen to the people that they are serving, and we are involved with governing them, and we are actually members of that community. And one of the questions is how do we increase the number of those institutions? How do we help more institutions sort of move there? Um, Obviously, I started writing the book from the perspective of sort of taking insurrectionism seriously, and taking seriously people who look at institutions and say, that doesn't work, we got to move beyond it. So I'm sympathetic to that point of view. I think, like a lot of people who lean left, I found myself early in the Trump presidency going, oh, wow, we really do need institutions, because having an individual who's untethered from institutions can be so phenomenally dangerous. And there was this very weird moment, I don't know if you remember it, where progressives are like cheering for the FBI. Like, we don't cheer for the FBI. Like, that's not generally how this works. But it was a reminder that when institutions prove themselves ineffective, when leaders go radically off the rails, we're looking for someone to be in charge. Where I came out on all of this was at that point of thinking about efficacy. And so what I found myself doing is I kind of took my advice in this book. I came out of this and said, what should I work on next? And the answer for me was, there's a lot on the internet that's broken right now. Social media in particular is badly broken. The surveillance ad model is badly broken. I don't think tinkering with Facebook around the edges and making it a little bit less evil is the way to go. I actually think that's a place where we need disruptive change. And so I'm now leading a project to try to bring about that disruptive change. And, who knows whether it's going to succeed or not, but I'm sort of trying to take my own journey in the book seriously, sort of looking at institutions and saying, this one is both broken beyond belief and is one that I understand enough that I feel like I can have some leverage on. Maybe this is the place to put in my shovel and dig. And that's what I'm sort of hoping to inspire people to do, is to kind of look at this and say, where in this sort of vast universe of things that are wrong and broken in the world can you personally find a way to be effective? And maybe it's inside an institution with incremental change because it's a high functioning institution. Maybe it's pressuring it from the outside. Maybe it's tearing it down and building something new. That's the challenge that I'm trying to put in front of people.
So maybe kind of a final question that I'd love to hear from you is that after kind of having written this book, um, could you speak either to an aspect of the book that in your presentation or thus far you didn't get to talk about, whether it was a case study or a vignette that you wrote about you want to share, or having written this book, is there one kind of institution or movement or group or individual that you think we should be paying attention to that would have ramifications for your argument on not only mistrust, but also perhaps a regenerative aspect of kind of of trust? So either something
Yeah, yeah.
yet that you wrote about, or book is done, but is there something now that you want us all plugged into that connect to what you kind of presented and shared with?
Well, let me say two, and I'll say it positive and negative. On the positive side of it, watch Taiwan. Taiwan had a full overturning of its government in 2014. The government that came in is technocratic. It's incredibly focused on citizen engagement. There's crazy folks involved with it, including Audrey Tang, who is a minister without portfolio, whose entire job is to sort of work on citizen participation. It is really, really interesting to watch a government so closely engaged with some of these issues. The main issue that Taiwan finds itself dealing with right now is misinformation from China. And you can imagine, if you were engaged in a multi-year propaganda war with China, that would be a really interesting place to be. So there's enormous amounts of sort of optimism and lessons learned from Taiwan. The last thing, which you didn't ask, and I'm going to address just because people should ask me this, which is, we had a literal physical insurrection in the US Capitol, a little more than 2 months ago. How does that fit in with this model? And what I've been trying to process it, and I'm a slow thinker. It took me 7 years to write this. It's going to take me a year before I have an answer that I like to this question. But I think one thing to think about is that Mistrust can be synthesized.
Mhm.
It can be created. It can be manipulated. I think there are folks on the far right who have had weaponized mistrust sort of directed at them. It's not that they don't have mistrust to start with. There's been research that suggests that a lot of the people who stormed the Capitol had terrible financial problems. They had some way in which the current American system wasn't working for them. But they were also exposed to this stream of disinformation urging people to mistrust the media, the deep state, all sorts of different things there. I got taken to task by a scholar for sort of mentioning the Capitol insurrection and defund the police in the same breath. And I should be really, really clear. I don't think they're coming from the same place. I think movements like defund the police are coming from genuine organic mistrust coming out of many, many decades of structural racism. Whereas I think the folks who stormed the Capitol were manipulated to this level of very high mistrust. I do think that mistrust actually is a common bond between them, and it shows both how dangerous and how powerful it can end up being. So that is literally the most uncomfortable question I get during these talks. And since you didn't ask it to me, I thought I would ask it
Yeah.
to myself just to try to be intellectually honest on it.
No, absolutely, and also that less than 48 hours before was the kind of results from the Georgia runoff
That's
synod.
right.
And so, speaking of not only the within Georgia, the speaking of the movement for Black Lives and different kind of allies on the one hand, and then the insurrection on the Capitol on the other, it's pointing very much to what you're presenting.
That's
So the book
right.
is Mistrust: Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them by Ethan Zuckerman, and the book is published by W.W. Norton and Company. Please, all of you, read it. For those who are in Williamstown, the Williams Bookstore, we, between the Schumann Program and the Center for Learning and Action, have free copies of that book. And for others, hopefully you're able to acquire it and talk about it by other means. Thank you, Ethan, and thank
Neil,
you.
thank you so much. This was just a joy. Thank you for all the people who came out to this. Particularly, thank you to my classmates and some of the folks who sort of came back for this. It's been wonderful having you there and having questions from you. And thanks so much, Neil. I really enjoyed that.
We'd love to have you back anytime.
Let's do it in person next time. Cheers. Take care.